The first part of the presentation introduced LMS 2012. The second part will deal with the second learning objective, which is the concept of the standard as the servant rather than the master. A lot of organizations feel they have to register to a standard like ISO 9001 or ISO TS 16949 to get the certificate on the wall and keep their customers happy, or perhaps they view it as a marketing feature. They can point to an ISO 9001 certificate and show it to their customers, and the marketing department likes to point to it. But in that case, the standard as the objective in its own right becomes the master as opposed to the servant. When it's the servant, it becomes a means to an end, namely like good quality and low cost. When the standard is an objective in itself and it's the master as opposed to the servant, that's when it becomes a costly and time-consuming annoyance. However, when the standard is treated as the servant, it becomes indispensable to world-class performance, and ISO 14001 provides an excellent, proven, real-world example of this concept. Here is an example of ISO 14001, the servant. As a matter of fact, many decades before ISO 14001 existed. Now, when Henry Ford was doing business, he could have legally dumped into the nearest river whatever environmental waste he couldn't put up his smokestack. There were few, if any, environmental protection laws at the time, and there certainly wasn't an environmental protection agency. However, Ford attempted to achieve zero-emission manufacturing. This is clear from his books and from his business practices, and he made enormous profits by doing so. For example, if you've ever seen Kingsford charcoal, which is the popular charcoal for backyard barbecues, Kingsford charcoal is what happened to wood waste for which Ford could find no other use. Now, wood was used at the Ford company until it was no longer serviceable. If a tool handle broke, it was machined down to become a smaller tool handle. There was a story to the effect that crates in which Ford received parts, the boards were of a very specific size, so when the crates were opened, they could be turned into Model T floorboards. And Ford would certainly not simply smash a crate. He would use it for another load. He'd send it back for another load, in other words, returnable packaging or something to that effect. But wood that was no longer serviceable went to a wood distillation plant which produced chemicals. Methyl alcohol, of course, is a product of wood distillation, and Kingsford charcoal. And this wood distillation delivered $12,000 a day in the money of the early 1920s, which at the time Ford was paying a $6 a day wage, which was very high, which meant he essentially had 2,000 workers simply hired on the basis of whatever he was making from his wood distillation operations. Slag from blast furnaces was turned into cement and paving materials, so a use was found for everything. He even had an innovative way of using coal. Instead of burning the coal, he would turn it into coke, which is primarily carbon, recover the coal chemicals and sell them for far more than the coal itself was worth. That included, by the way, the sulfur compounds that would have otherwise become pollutants. The sulfur ended up as ammonium sulfate, which could be sold as fertilizer. Paint solvents were recovered and reused until they were no longer serviceable. Ford got about 10 gallons worth of use out of a gallon of paint solvent by recovering and reusing it. So this shows that use of ISO 14001, or simply the concept of ISO 14001 as the servant rather than the master, is enormously profitable. In this example, if you look at ISO 14000 as the means to an end as opposed to an end in itself, it illustrates the concept of the standard as the servant rather than the master. The same concept, of course, carries over into other standards, including ISO 9001, ISO TS 16949. Now we'll get into the purpose of standardization, and the concepts here carry over into the quality management system standard, assuming that you are registered to a standard like ISO 9001 or ISO TS 16949. Standardization prevents backsliding. It's a means of holding the gains of previous efforts. Extremely important concept. Suppose you have a group of workers that are lifting a heavy load, maybe even lifting a bucket out of a well when wells still work that way, and somebody's grip on the load slips. Well, you don't want that load to fall all the way down to the bottom, so you have to do all the work of lifting it up again. So you have a ratchet which makes sure that if you stop lifting for a moment, or if your grip on the load slips, the load isn't going to fall back to the bottom and you won't have to do the work over again. A standard does the same thing. If you've invested work in quality and productivity improvements, the standard prevents you from losing your work and having your work lost. Let's say if a key person retires, or if there's some personnel change, or if there's some other reason that the improvement would otherwise be forgotten. Remember that the Ford Motor Company did lose its world-class lean manufacturing culture and system after the loss of three key people: Henry Ford, Edsel Ford, and production chief Charles Sorensen. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, speculated that many efficiency improvements, or even worker knacks, a worker figures out a way to do a job a little faster, a little more efficiently, have been lost throughout history due to lack of standardization. So it's extremely useful to view standardization as the ratchet that holds the gains, prevents the loss of work. Just as a mechanical ratchet makes it impossible for people to lose the results of physical labor, a standard prevents loss of hard-earned knowledge, and that's where we come to the need for documentation. People have this image that ISO 9001, for example, is all about documentation and document control systems. The documentation is a servant. Again, it's a means to an end as opposed to an end in itself. And what you learn here can apply to your quality system as well as this lean management system. There's a common misconception about the ISO series of standards, that especially ISO 9001, that they're all about documentation. The truth, however, is that the progress of all human enterprises depends on written records. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen, or may as well not have happened. This again makes documentation the servant and not the master. It's particularly telling, by the way, that human societies and civilizations did not advance very rapidly in terms of technology until there was some form of written records, and that rate of technological advance increased very quickly when the printing press was invented. That was a major innovation. Now we have the internet with Google searches and so on. The rate of technological advancement is going to increase very quickly as a result. So documentation is extremely important for the advance of progress in any kind of organization. Here's an example. The Romans developed an animal-powered harvester known as a valus. It was another term for it was a push scythe, which meant the animal, like a donkey or a horse, pushed the harvester from behind. If the animal walked in front, it would trample the crops, but by putting the animal behind the harvester would cut the crops down and they would fall into a basket or a cart. It was an excellent labor-saving device, but if you look at pictures of farmers and agriculture through the early 19th century, you'll see pictures of farmers with scythes in their hands, reaping the crops with scythes, which was very labor-intensive. So for some reason, the concept of this animal-powered harvester was lost for more than 1,000 years. Now you can imagine what the scythe-using farmers felt when they saw this picture, and this is from J.C. Loudon's Encyclopedia of Agriculture, which was published in 1825, and there you see a picture of the Roman push scythe with what looks like an ox pushing it along and doing an enormous amount of work instead of people having to bend over and cut the crops with scythes to harvest them. So when the people saw this, they said, how could we have done the job this way for generations of agriculture? Well, the reason was, well, I suppose it was written down because the Romans had pictures of it, but it wasn't written down in the right place, and it took about 1,000 years before the right person saw the pictures, realized their importance, and put them down in an encyclopedia, whereupon inventors began jumping on the concept and developing animal-powered and then later mechanical-powered harvesting machines. For example, 19th century inventor John Ridley invented, or rather reinvented, animal-powered harvesting machines based on the picture of the Roman device, which means that the Romans wrote it down and they preserved and propagated the best known way to do the job in question, which eventually had some benefit for those who paid attention. Now, that was the best known way to do the job for the Romans, but because apparently the knowledge was somehow lost, farmers resorted to a very inefficient, labor-intensive method for about the next 1,000 years. Frederick Taylor, as I mentioned, speculated that that had happened with a lot of trades. For example, bricklaying, one of the world's oldest trades. People have doubtlessly figured out many times how to improve that, but the improvements didn't last. Only when Frank Gilbreth came out with the non-stooping scaffold did masons, bricklayers, figure out that it probably wasn't a good idea to have the bricks on the ground where they had to bend over and pick up each brick one at a time, thus raising and lowering their entire upper body weight to do it. Rome was one of the world's greatest and most widespread civilization. Actually, a lot of modern laws are based to a degree on Roman law. The symbol of the eagle comes from the Roman eagle, so we know quite a bit about the Romans, but apparently not much about this particular invention, the animal-powered harvester. So why didn't this invention benefit the Romans? And the answer can be summed up as Ludditism. The Luddites were workers in the early 19th century, late 18th century, who smashed textile machinery because they were afraid it would take their job away. And the Romans were afraid that the vallis would make their slaves idle. They didn't know what they would do with all these slaves with no time on their hands, so they didn't really want to implement something like this. Now, this Ludditism is a problem today. We'll see that later on in the presentation. And it's because workers are afraid that efficiency improvement, and that includes lean manufacturing, will put them out of work, which underscores the importance of addressing the human behavioral elements as well as the technological aspects of lean manufacturing, which incidentally Henry Ford did. He addressed both aspects. That was in his universal code, and that's why the system worked so well for him. Documentation ties in with something called best practice deployment, and what best practice deployment means is propagating a superior way to do a job to related activities in the organization. If you figure out a way to do a job better for one process, you want to look at processes that are similar to see if the knowledge can be used there as well. The Automotive Industry Action Group has something called the read-across replicate process, and also a lessons learned database. The reference for that is AIAG's CQI-10 Effective Problem Solving a Guideline, which is available from the Automotive Industry Action Group. The examples we've seen of the role of documentation in the preservation and propagation of knowledge explains ISO's, quote, obsession with control of documents and records. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen or might as well have not have happened. and the knowledge of a valuable improvement can be lost unless records are kept. Of course, there are more mundane applications like inspections, tests, and so on. They have to be written down to show that they were done. That ties in with quality traceability, preventive maintenance. You have a log that shows the preventive maintenance was done. When viewed in this manner, though, document control becomes the servant, not the master, just like the standard is the servant and not the master. We saw previously that some organizations view ISO as a costly and time-consuming annoyance. However, now that we've seen more of it, especially the role of documentation, we can see that it's a framework, and following that framework prevents genuine costly and time-consuming annoyances like scrap, rework, and customer returns. There's an interesting story about that. It's the trouble that's prevented that nobody really appreciates. In other words, all they see is ISO and the work they have to put into ISO. What they don't see are the scrap, rework, customer returns, and the resulting corrective action requests they would have had to deal with if they didn't have ISO. Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, told the story of 3 doctors in the village. There was one doctor who cured serious diseases, so he was famous throughout China. Another doctor, they were 3 brothers. Another of the brothers cured diseases before they got too bad, so nobody really knew about him outside the village. And the 3rd doctor found a way to prevent the diseases, so nobody knew who he was at all. But of course, the one who prevented the diseases was obviously the most effective. ISO 9000 is pretty much the same. All you see is the time you have to put into it, the expense you have to put into it, but what you don't see is all the corrective action requests and so on you would have had to deal with if it wasn't there. So that's another way to keep it in perspective. Okay, how about audits? Audits are one of the most dreaded words in most organizations because someone is looking around to see what they can find wrong. Well, again, the audit is the servant and not the master. The purpose of an audit is never to catch people doing things wrong, but rather to uncover defects in the system in which they have to work. In fact, in Japan, workers are encouraged to audit themselves and their own processes, and if they make a mistake or if they catch themselves about to make a mistake, they're encouraged and in fact rewarded, praised, given other incentives to report the near miss or the error, and then they put in an error-proofing method, poka-yoke error-proofing, or otherwise change the job to make the mistake in question impossible. So that's how the Japanese look at audits and their equivalent. The idea is to find trouble or things that might make trouble, change the job, change the system in which people have to work, so that particular mistake or defect becomes impossible. Proactive organizations will therefore empower workers to identify quality problems and, in the context of lean manufacturing, all forms of waste or muta on their own. Okay, so in summary, conformance to the standard is therefore not an end in itself, namely getting the certificate, in which case the standard would be the master as opposed to the servant, but rather the means to ends like higher quality, prevention of defects, not having corrective action requests, lower costs, and happier customers. The next step is to standardize the lean manufacturing system, which leads to the 3rd learning objective, namely critical to lean versus critical to quality characteristics.